Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to the Catholic Mama, where you'll learn how to deepen and defend your faith, find comfort as we share the vocation of parenthood, and learn how to raise your children confidently Catholic. I'm your host, Christine Mooney Flynn. Let's get started. Welcome back to the Catholic Mama. This is your host, Christine Mooney Flynn. And today we are going to talk about a subject that I am decent at, but my guest here is even more decenter. The decentest at this. And he's my husband, of all people. Look at that. I'm giving you a compliment. Hello, husband.
Hello, wife.
Thank you for coming back once again.
Glad to be here. I see you are enjoying a glass of wine.
I am having a glass of wine. Our kids have all gone to bed at roughly the same hour, and I feel like that is a celebration in and of itself. So,
indeed. Well, since I'm being interviewed and I'm quite nervous, I'm just going to stick to water.
So clear your throat. So we, Pat and I are reconverts, as Pat is the case with Pat, to the Catholic faith, and I think we have a very we're very lucky in our abilities here because we had this major turning point. Everything changed, and it was a very clear demarcation. You know, we were one way. Suddenly, miraculously, we became another way. And I think it was almost easier in that sense to be able to say, oh, okay, these are my mistakes. Now I want to evangelize. These are my real thoughts and feelings about this. I've researched, blah, blah, blah. I'm here to talk about it. But we've come across a lot of people who have lived they're cradle Catholics or they're Protestants, and maybe they're curious about Catholics, or they just have some hangups about the Catholic faith, or maybe they want to evangelize and aren't quite sure how to do it. And it may be a timid thing for them because this is how they always have been, to be moderately religious, or they've been Christians, but how can they really branch out and be very bold with their faith? Mm-hmm. Don't you agree?
I agree immensely. I think so what we're talking about here is the subject of apologetics. Now, that word is tricky because people hear the word apologetics and they think you're saying sorry for something.
That's what I thought the first time I heard.
But that's not what apologetics means. Apologetic means giving reasons for what you believe, or really a defense of something. It means to be on guard in relation to your faith. And Christian apologetics has actually experienced a great resurgence in fairly recent years after it kind of dropped off almost completely for a while. And I think there's many reasons for that. Unfortunately, there was a great dearth of apologetics for a long time through many generations. And I think there's been a lot of there's been great tragedy because of that. People were brought up in the faith, but they didn't fully understand the faith. The reasons for why they believed and what they believed. It was merely taken on authority. Now, authority is not a bad thing. We take things on authority almost all the time.
But if it's just this, take this or else.
That's right. But you also want to be able to substantiate those claims. And people rail against authority, but look, most people take it on authority that E equals MC squared, but they wouldn't have the first clue how to substantiate that, or even what those letters mean. But they take it on authority because they think there's good reasons to believe that is true. Outside of actually being a mathematician or physicist. Well, again, on faith, it's not necessarily bad to be introduced to something because of an authority. But for many generations, when the apologetic tradition sort of was toned down, didn't completely disappear, people who came up into faith did not have the sort of philosophical or rational underpinnings for their beliefs. And, a number of them that lost their faith themselves, but also I think were unable to effectively pass it on to their children. And I think the loss of the apologetic tradition, we're paying for it now. And I think that because of that, there's been a resurgence in apologetics. Yes, we actually have great reasons, the best reasons for being Catholic or what have you. So to your original point, which was, trying to get people to go out and be evangelists, I think, there's many different ways that this could be approached, but I think having some basic understanding of arguments for why you believe certain things is I would like to say necessary, especially for most people in today's age who are not religious and remain very skeptical, remain very dubious or even hostile towards religion. Even just having a series of basic arguments for the central tenets of the faith is something that I feel everybody should have and can be fairly easily equipped with not too much time or training.
That's great. Yeah. And this has come up because we've had a lot of conversations, I think because Pat and I have been very open and confident about our resurgence in faith. Mm-hmm. And we've had a lot of conversations with people who grew up without the logic and the understanding of the logic and reason behind the faith. And now they're very lukewarm or they're timid. They have a lot of questions, but maybe they don't even have any idea of who to ask. Mm-hmm. And if you're listening, maybe you have these questions, or you can be the person who has the answers if you are faced with any of these questions later on. So we've been visiting with friends and family over the past few weeks. And even before that, we've gotten a lot of the same questions over and over again. And we thought, this would actually be a great podcast episode to kind of go through these very common and really, regardless of who we're speaking to, regardless of geography across America that we're speaking to these people, the hang-ups about the religion are all pretty much the same.
Yeah, you will face a series of, I would say, essentially 5 to 10 stock objections almost universally, and it seems like the dogs are having something of a conniption fit upstairs. So hold on. And we're back. Apologies for that. The dogs started bursting into some type of quivering rage upstairs.
It probably means somebody was walking outside.
Yeah, so spare you that noise. By the way, we're staying with my dad currently in Wisconsin, and they have upstairs is a Saint Bernard, a pit bull thing, a terrier thing, and what's the last one?
Boxer.
A boxer.
That's it.
And not a boxer thing. I think he's a pure boxer. So wonderful and interesting dogs, but often quite... and
the neighbor's dog could be over. There could be upwards of 5 dogs upstairs. It sounds like it.
It's essentially an idiotic circus upstairs right now.
Add on to that 3 children and 4 adults. It is a lively household.
Indeed.
Actually, I was just thinking about this. We have the St. Bernard. We have the 3 kids, the 2 of us. Anywhere we go now, we truly bring an entire household with us.
We bring the circus.
I'm sure the dogs are barking before we got here. I know they were, but the noise level and just, I'm going to say the joy that we bring.
It is joy. It's great. It is wonderful fun. But back to what we were talking about before. So, when you begin to evangelize, I would say there are about 5 to 10 stock objections that you can just count on. These just come up again and again and again and again. Now, with some people who might be a little further along or a little bit more spiritually or religiously invested, you might have to, move above the stock objection. But again, I think if you can just address some of the very common obstacles that people have to Christianity in general and Catholicism in specific, you can really, and for me, it's all about lowering the barrier to entry, which we were talking about. When I'm talking to people and I'm trying to get them to understand the faith, I want to be very clear about what is necessary and what is not necessary for becoming a Christian. A lot of people get so held up on just insignificant arguments or quibbles that are really not essential or necessary for becoming a Christian. So I like to kind of focus on things that are necessary or critical for becoming a Christian. And to that, there's really only two questions that you need to answer. One is the existence of God, and two is Jesus who he claimed to be. And if you can answer both of those with more plausibility than not, if you can give good reasons that both of those are true, then you have all the grounds you need for becoming at least a mere Christian.
Now, I think in our previous episode where we start diving into the logic behind Christianity, we covered the existence of God, right? So I don't know if you want to give a very brief, or should we just direct people to go back and listen to that episode?
No, well, I have a lot of resources, but this is a big one. And when we were with some friends over the weekend, great friends, we had it was the typical discussion, really, but very thoughtful, very considerate, and it was a really, I wish we would have recorded it because it would have made such a good podcast episode to see.
Well, you would have heard kids screaming and then running the background.
Yeah, and running around without pants on while we're trying to talk about the existence of God,
joys of parenthood,
resurrection of Jesus, and this and that. But it was such I think it was such a wonderful exposition of a dialogue that was really productive and engaging and I think interesting and joyful for everybody involved. And I remember the gentleman I was talking with said afterwards that it was for him. He was very agnostic going into the conversation. He said that this was the most authentic and engaging conversation he's ever had with a Catholic. And he said he really wanted to consider a lot of the things I said. He didn't run off to go get baptized by any means, but
well, he already was baptized.
But he was Episcopalian. Episcopalian moved into agnosticism was his story.
Yeah. So we can talk about how great this conversation was. Unfortunately, nobody can hear it now, but we can at least. I mean, as Pat said, the questions that came up are very typical in any of the conversations we've had over the previous months. And these are so. I don't know if you want to go. Do you want to talk about the existence of God? Do you want to go right into?
Well, yeah. So when it comes to evangelization and apologetics, I like to push everything back as far as possible because people will sometimes get hung up on arguments that are very hard to substantiate or argue for unless you've already agreed on certain principles or axioms that precede it. For example, morality and moral doctrine and church teaching when it comes to morals. There's no use in starting there if you haven't first established the existence of God, because this would be the ontological foundation for morality. Now, ontological sounds like a tangly word, but it really just means ontology is a study of being, the suchness of things as they exist. Do they exist? What are they like? It's really one of the most foundational questions. When we say like the ontology of morality, we think about, is morality something that actually exists independent of our opinions, for example? Is there really and truly a moral law to the universe? And in order to affirm that and say, yes, we would need to ground that in a transcendent being, a moral law giver, which is what we talked about on the first episode. So that's why I like to push the conversation back as much as possible. And in this instance, this was a sticking point for at least one of the people we were talking with that night. He was agnostic. He could have gone either way. He wasn't sure if God existed or if God didn't exist. So by pushing it back, you can help to discern where people's sticking points really are. And this is one of the most effective things of evangelization and apologetics is just ask questions. Don't just start bombarding people because it might be totally irrelevant.
I'm sorry, real quick. When you just said bombarding people, it reminded me when I was in high school and everybody was leaving campus on their cars. There was a group of people who would occasionally show up and they had little mini Bibles and they would, with like softball pitches, chuck the Bibles and try to get them into the cars as they were driving by.
Yeah, I don't see that as being very attractive to anybody.
It wasn't. It made Christianity a laughing stock in a way, that these people would be willing to take these mini Bibles and just throw them as hard as they could, hoping they would make it into an open window.
Yeah, that would have infuriated me, and probably was that type of behavior was something that infuriated me when I was a skeptic. And as much as we certainly want to affirm the power of Scripture and the authority of Scripture, we can't just assume that throwing a Bible at somebody is going to make any difference.
And that holds figuratively as well. So again, I'm just
Now, it might. Now, I'm not denying the power of the Holy Spirit here before anyone accuses me of heresy, but I think that it might be better to channel the Holy Spirit through yourself and other more productive means. So, it seems lazy almost to just throw a Bible at somebody.
Yeah, good luck. Here you go.
Driving away, right?
Yeah.
Rather
but
than
even figuratively, you don't want to bombard people with things that they don't quite need or not quite ready yet for. So I think I like your idea, that strategy of, and I've seen it in action, is we've had people have very contemporary problems. And I'm saying contemporary, I'm sure these problems existed for skeptics throughout the ages, but people come with very contemporary examples of the problems they have with Christianity or Catholicism. And a typical discussion or argument or debate, I should say, that could be a stopping point, not like a non-starter. But if you can push it back and make it very fundamental, start with those fundamentals and work your way up there, you can really kind of dispel any of these issues in the first place.
That's right. And the Bible's a good one too, because if somebody doesn't believe in God, they're not going to take the Bible seriously. If they don't believe in Jesus, they probably won't take the Bible seriously. So you're kind of putting the cart in front of the horse there. Now, if you get to a point where somebody believes in God, they believe in Jesus, but they don't subscribe to the Bible, well, then you can use Jesus as an argument for them. Jesus believed in the Bible, right? At least the Old Testament, before the New Testament came around. So if it was good enough for Jesus and you believe in Jesus, it should be good enough for you. So this is where you can use Jesus as a logical argument for the authority in Scripture. But if you haven't established Jesus as an authority, then it's going to be pointless for somebody. So yeah, I push it all the way back. And for the gentleman I was talking with, I could probably just use his name. I'm sure he wouldn't care, but try to keep some anonymity here. He was on the fence. He was agnostic. So this is, I said, hey, I was the same way. And people like relatability too. And I think part of the reason, like you said at the beginning episode, is our story is one that people can relate to, in the sense that we've been there. We were not only skeptics, we were quite anti-religious. So I always do my best to try to relate to people. Again, it's not about trying to be right. It's about trying to form a relationship. And when you can form a relationship with people, that's when they become receptive to what you have to say, rather than I've got the truth and I'm going to literally throw it at you like a brick, right? Not effect. And this is very important when it comes to evangelization and apologetics. You have to consider both sides. The matter, that is, what are you saying? Are you making good arguments? But to the manner, how do you present them? And are you doing it in a gracious and respectful way? Are you really trying to build and foster a relationship? And one of the best apologetic tools is just patience, taking the time to develop a relationship until somebody is receptive to you. They're going to hear what you have to say. So it might be best to just avoid any direct evangelization for a while until somebody honestly wants to even give you their ear to begin with. Find other points of common ground, form a friendship with somebody, and then start to introduce them.
Live by the Christian principles in the meantime.
Yeah, and that's playing a longer game, but that is, I think, the winning game. And then once they are receptive, then they'll want to hear the arguments. People want to agree with people they like, fundamentally. So you can use friendship and personality. I don't want to be like, oh, you're just manipulating them. No, you're not. You're helping them. It's not manipulation, right? It's spreading the word, but doing what's effective. And so I'd feel remiss if I left that out. We just went into the argument. So I was telling this gentleman that I think that there is an exceptionally great number of reasons for believing that theism is true, or that is that God exists. And there just are not equally good reasons for thinking that atheism is true. There's just not any good arguments. And then the common stock objection is, yeah, but you can't really prove a negative. So how could you prove that God doesn't exist? And this is something you hear a lot on the popular level, but it's not a good argument. You can prove that something doesn't exist just by showing that it's logically incoherent. For example, there is no such thing as a square circle. It's logically incoherent. When you understand the concept of a square and the concept of a circle, you understand that this is just a meaningless assembly of words. There is no such thing as a square circle. Or another famous example that people use for this would be a married bachelor. There's no such thing as a married bachelor. It's logically incoherent. So all you would have to do to show that God does not exist is prove that the concept of God, of a maximally great being, is logically incoherent. And nobody's ever been able to do that. So you can prove that something doesn't exist. You have to just show that it's incoherent in some way. And that resonated with him. That resonates with a lot of people. And then when you say, okay, so, nobody's ever been able to prove that God is logically incoherent as a concept, but do we have good arguments for thinking that God exists? And then what I have found here is we don't have to go into arguments in depth. We can do that in other episodes. Sometimes if you just list the arguments and people hear that there are just a great many good reasons for why God exists, that's enough. They just didn't even know that reasons existed to begin with. They're just saying, like, here's a number of arguments. We could have the kalam argument, the contingency argument, the moral argument, the ontological argument. And you can briefly describe each of these. God is the best explanation for why anything exists rather than nothing. God is the best explanation for the origin or the universe coming into being. God is the best explanation for objective morality. And you can kind of go on. And then people might be curious about those. They're like, oh, explain that one to me. And then you're like, okay, I'll explain this one. And he did. So, for example, this gentleman said, okay, what is that first one you said? I said, oh, God is the best explanation for the universe coming to being, which would be the famous Kalam cosmological argument. And this is a good one because it's pretty simple. And it's just a series of premises that lead to a conclusion. So I hate saying it. This gentleman is a smart guy. He's a lawyer, so he has, like, he's an analytic thinker. So I didn't have to explain basic logic and logical arguments to him, but I think it might be the case sometimes that you might have to do that, where you have a series of premises that lead to a conclusion. But the argument is simply this: everything that begins to exist has a cause. That's the first step. Number two, the universe began to exist. And then it just follows necessarily that the universe has a cause. And then when you think about what that cause must be, well, if the universe is all of space-time reality, then the cause must be beyond space-time reality. It would be timeless, spaceless, immaterial, extremely powerful, possessed of intellect, and essentially everything that we consider God to be. So this argument would give you the existence of a monotheistic God. It doesn't prove that Christianity is true or that it's a Christian God, but that's not what we're trying to do with the argument. Now, all you have to do is support those first two premises, which, again, he agreed with both of them outright. So there was no objection. I'm like, can you think of anything that began to exist that has a cause? And he said no. And I said, okay, do you agree that the universe began to exist? And he's like, yeah, I think that all of the scientific evidence strongly suggests that's the case. Well, then it follows necessarily that the universe must have a cause. And that was an effective, I think, presentation for him. I also gave him the argument from contingency, which he seemed to really like. So, you kind of can play around with these and these, again, you don't have to be an extremely deep philosopher to present these arguments on a basic level. And so I think this is why some people are timid, because they think, well, I'm going to be challenged on these. I'm not going to be able to defend them at a very high level. But I'm telling you, I would say like 9 times out of 10, people just hearing a list of these arguments or reasons is enough for them to just become curious and want to investigate further.
Yeah, and even if you are pressed on some of these issues or reasons and you're not quite sure you can explain it very well, that's fine to say that you don't know that either. I'll come back to you. And say, when it was explained to me, I got it really well. I don't think I could explain it that well to you right now. Let me get back to you with it. I'll give you some resources.
And that humility is a really good tool and thing, and something that will impress people, because you're gonna come off as a lot more sincere because you are being sincere. Go figure. The other thing I would say is, maybe you do kind of bone up on 1 or 2 of these, and you kind of strengthen up just a few of them, just in case. Again, they're not that difficult, but they're so useful. But again, I don't want anybody to feel intimidated. Like, I can't evangelize because I don't understand philosophy. I don't understand these arguments. But I'm telling you, but you can present it, be like, hey, I'm not a philosopher. I can't defend these arguments all the way to the ground. But I can tell you that I've heard these various arguments and I found them convincing. And I think if you look them up and read these philosophers, you might find them convincing as well. And that would be enough.
There are experts who have done all of the work for you already. You can simply point them in the right direction.
Yeah. And see, I personally like,
I know you do.
I like making the arguments. So it's,
and you're good at it.
It's it's something that I've always enjoyed doing.
Arguing. Yes, I've noticed.
And when we say arguments, I mean it in the philosophical sense of just giving reasons for a conclusion. I don't mean it like we're fighting or having an emotional disagreement. So again, like the word apologetics, argument is not something, at least in the way we're using it, that should be looked down upon or avoided. In philosophy, arguments are encouraged because it's giving reasons for a conclusion, and that's all we mean by arguments for God's existence. But I think what you said is a really, really good point. Is you can just come in with that humility rather than fall back on it and say, hey, I was struggling over this question of God's existence for a long time. I read these 5 arguments and I thought, wow, these are really good. And that's what convinced me. And here's a great author that you can go and read on this, or here's some resources. And that would be, I think, a very effective apologetic effort, especially if you already have a relationship with this person. I guarantee that they would go forward with that.
Right. Now, I think at the beginning you had said that you wanted to, one of the objections was, whether or not God actually exists. The second one was about what was the other question? I mean, to become a Christian was believing in Jesus, correct?
Jesus, yeah, right. He's the hinge point on Christianity, right? God is the hinge point, obviously, on atheism. So if we clear that, then we believe that God exists. We can survey all the various religions, and one really stands out as quite peculiar because one says that God actually came to earth and said things and did stuff, right? And that religion that said God came to earth and said things and did stuff is Christianity, and it is so unique in its claim. So either this religion, because of its radical claims, because of the claims of Jesus, who was a radical, and I think that's worth emphasizing to people, is Jesus has been heavily mythicized in certain ways. There's this kind of like liberal theology that tries to make Jesus this spiritual guru or very politically correct, leader or something like that. And that just wasn't Jesus at all. He was a radical. He made radical claims of being able to perform miracles, of casting out demons. And of course, there's that whole resurrection thing. So these can't be ignored. So sometimes just, painting an accurate picture of Jesus. And I like to say, there's the politically correct Jesus, this kind of old age Deepak Chopra type of fellow. And then there's the factually correct Jesus, which is a radical figure. He was not like Buddha. Buddha did not claim to be a god. He claimed to have a way or a method. Jesus claimed to be God. And that is a radical claim. So it kind of puts you in this awkward position. And C.S. Lewis kind of made this famous presentation of what's called the trilemma argument. When you understand Jesus in the historical context and you understand the facts surrounding Jesus, then you realize he either had to be who he said he was, Lord, or he had to be a liar or a lunatic. But you can't have him as some type of nice spiritual guru or something like that. So he had to either be exactly who he claimed, or the devil, or something worse, as C.S. Lewis says it. He does not leave the door open to interpret him any other way than that. And he did not intend to, as Lewis said. Which really kind of rattles people, and that rattled me too. First, I remember we were talking about kind of the story, when we were kind of dabbling around in heresies. I mean, Buddhism for a while. One of and the guy was a wonderful meditation teacher, but here's the interesting thing. He said he always had to pull to Jesus, right? He said he always had to pull to Jesus. For whatever reason, he couldn't explain it. So he always saw Jesus as a great spiritual teacher and tried to talk about Jesus through a very Buddhist perspective. And this encouraged me to go look at the Bible and the passages he was quoting. And when I was reading this, I'm like, this is not the same Jesus that he was talking about. Was he reading the same book, Bible, that I was reading? Like, this is like how he got his interpretation out of this text, which he was going off. I think it was the Gospel of Mark. Just it was a feat of mental gymnastics, to be sure. It was just not the same. And that was one of the times where the sheer radicality of Jesus got me. So I think sometimes that you just got to clear people up on that there's no way you can really look at the historical Jesus and see him as some sort of just one of many spiritual gurus.
Do you have any advice then for people who, if you are having a conversation with somebody who, maybe an atheist, I don't know if you'd get this far into a conversation, but maybe you would. If they didn't believe in Jesus, how do you argue with something like that when they won't even play on the same field that you're playing on?
Yeah, well, the idea of a good argument in philosophy isn't that you can prove something with 100% certainty. That just in the vast majority of philosophical arguments, in the vast majority of decisions we make in life, we do not operate off certainty. I do not have absolute certainty that I will drive to the grocery store tomorrow and not be sucked up by a tornado. I cannot prove that, but I have pretty good reason that it probably isn't going to be the case, right? So when it comes to good arguments, we look at plausibility. Is this more plausibly true than not? But to make an argument really, really good, what you want to do is raise the intellectual stakes so high that for somebody to deny the argument would just cause them to seem very irrational. Right. So, for example, going back to that Kalam argument, everything that begins to exist has a cause. People will try to deny that, but it makes them, and they can deny it. They're well within their rights, but I wouldn't say rational rights. And then what happens is they just appear very irrational because there's no experience that we know of, or even metaphysical possibility that we can imagine something just popping into being out of nothing, right? So somebody has to subscribe to something that is essentially worse than magic if they want to try and deny that first premise, which they can do that, and certainly people do. But then, it's just hard to take their position seriously anymore. So that's the idea of a good argument. Now, when it comes to Jesus, there's the very famous minimal facts approach, which apologists sometimes use. And that's looking at, and this is taking it, you're not using the Bible to substantiate Jesus, because that would try to be arguing in a circle. What you do is you say, here are the minimum facts that historians agree upon when it concerning the life of Jesus.
Not just Christians.
Not just Christians.
Okay.
Historians across the board, New Testament scholars and otherwise. And they agree on essentially 3 to 4 fundamental facts of Jesus's life. One, that he existed. He was an actual person, right? So you can't subscribe to Jesus's legend or myth unless you're willing to go against the overwhelming historical consensus. And again, somebody might be willing to do that, but they would just, they'd be on like an Alex Jones level of conspiracy, and nobody wants to go there. At least they shouldn't want to go there, right? They might still do it, but only on pain of irrationality. So Jesus was an actual historical figure. He existed. He was crucified, and he died, and he was buried. His tomb was found empty, and individuals and groups claim to have experienced seeing Jesus resurrected, and many of them went to their deaths proclaiming that belief. Now, none of these facts by themselves necessarily prove that the resurrection is true, but these are facts that are agreed upon, again, in the overwhelming majority by historians. So what you have to do then is say, okay, well, what explains these facts? What, did Jesus really rise from the dead, or is there some other type of explanation? Now, obviously, the resurrection hypothesis satisfies all of these as an explanation, and quite well. It would make sense of every one of these historical facts. But what about something like the most popular, as we were going, and this was literally part of the conversation we had, alternative naturalistic explanation would be like, oh, well, people were just hallucinating. But that one fails miserably because it doesn't explain how large groups of people could all have the same hallucination.
500 people.
Yeah, hallucinations aren't group experiences. And if 500 people all did have the same hallucination, that itself would be a miracle. It also doesn't explain why skeptics and people who were not followers of Jesus or who were actually persecutors of Christian would have these hallucinations, because a lot of the theory depends on, his followers were so traumatized that, they just had these hallucinations. So again, it doesn't have sufficient explanatory power or scope. So that is probably the most popular alternative explanation. And it just does not explain the facts at all. It fails miserably. Of course, there's other ones like conspiracy theories, But again, liars make really bad martyrs, and it doesn't explain people like St. Paul and other people who were skeptics and persecutors. So that one failed. So you can just go down the line or even ask other people to try to explain these facts. But this is a really powerful argument. And there's other arguments we can give as well. But I think the minimal facts approach is a really good starting point to show that as a way of explaining the basic critical essential facts of the life, death, and appearances of Jesus to followers and many others after his death, that the only thing that really offers a satisfactory explanation to any of this is that Jesus was who he claimed he was and that God rose him from the dead.
So say you are out at a dinner party and the conversation of Catholicism or Christianity comes up. Regardless of the starting question, you personally would say, bring it further back. Say, wait a minute, hold up. Let's get on a level playing field, understand where we're coming from. We'll go back and let's start with the creation of the universe or the existence of God.
Yeah, I really try to figure out where people's actual hang up is, because people will sometimes argue over one thing, but that one thing will be more or less an excuse or a rationalization for a different, more fundamental belief. And what I have found most times is people are often hung up on either of those two hinge points. They're not sure about the existence of God, or they do think that God exists, but they aren't sure that it's the Christian God, right? And that's why if you're gonna bone up on any two areas of emphasis, these are really important, because these are the minimum requirements for becoming Christian.
Believing in God, believing in Jesus,
and that Jesus was God,
okay.
Right? If you can say that God exists and that Jesus was God, you are not only well within your rational rights to accept the Christian belief, but you should do so, and you should want to do so. And that's it. You don't have to get into all the quibbles that people get so hung up on of like specific church doctrines, or the differences between various denominations, or the interplay between science and religion. All those are, I'm not saying they're not important, but they're just not primary. So you focus on the fundamental, essential things that a person really needs to believe to not only become a Christian and be very rational in doing so, but to want to become a Christian. Because if these things are true, then Christianity is true, at least on some form.
Okay. So if you get those two questions, now the conversation was far beyond just those two.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of as a teaser, because if you would like to come back on my show, I would like you to come back on my show, and maybe we can talk more about some of the other questions that came up in this particular conversation that we've been talking about, but also just in general, the ones that we've been part of. So it kind of as a teaser, could you list out maybe some of the other questions that you would like to cover in another episode? Yeah,
well, I think the next natural step is if you get somebody to a mere Christianity, you then want to figure out, okay, well, which Christianity then, if any Christianity? Some people might stop at a mere Christianity and that's it. C.S. Lewis, and people should just read C.S. Lewis, and they should also recommend C.S. Lewis. He is one of the best apologists. I avoided him for a long time just because he was, I thought he was old, and no way did that hold up. I couldn't have been more wrong. But he says that this position of mere Christianity is like being in a hallway, and you don't want to stay in a hallway. You want to go into a room. The room is where a cozy fire is, and you can get fed and this or that. But our first step is just get people into the hallway and then help them decide on the right room. And this is where there's another hinge point, which is between Protestantism and Catholicism. And just like the existence of God and the resurrection of Jesus, there are about just 1 to 2 essential things that we need to consider to say, okay, either Catholicism is true or more plausibly true than not, or I got to go the way of Protestantism. And those would be the doctrines that Martin Luther, of course, made famous, which would be sola scriptura, meaning we should go by scripture alone, or sola fide, which means faith alone, salvation by faith alone. And I think that these are easily refuted. And
I've seen you strike these down very quickly.
And in doing so, you have a very strong basis to think that even though the church is always in need of reformation, it was not in need of a revolution, which is what the Protestant quote unquote Reformation really was.
It was a rebellion.
It was a rebellion and a revolution, not a reformation. The church had its reformation, the Counter Reformation, which was great and awesome. So again, trying to figure out what those essential hinge points are, because sometimes when it comes to various denominations, they'll quibble over other differences in doctrine that are much further down the line. But what is and was the fundamental breaking point? And sola scriptura and sola fide are the two that every Catholic should be familiar with and know the responses to in order to start to defend not just Christianity in general, but Catholicism in particular. And I guess we'll save that for a future one.
We will, yeah. So we've gone through the minimalist approach to Christianity. This is where you have to be a Christian. The next episode that we do this together, I would like to talk about the minimal requirements to be a Catholic.
Indeed.
And that's really where we get that's just wonderful. That's a wonderful conversation. Gets me excited.
Thanks for having me on.
Yes, thanks for coming back. And so if you have, and I think we'll get into this a little bit more in a moment, but just a reminder, if you haven't already, head to thecatholicmama.com. You can get a free ebook on how to talk to your kids about God with 7 questions that keep coming up. These are tough ones, nitty-gritty ones, but they're not only good just for the kids. This would be a great little handbook for your own evangelization efforts, and will help you understand, what is God, why is the resurrection important, will other people resurrect? That was one of the ones our son asked a lot, if George Washington was going to resurrect. So maybe that's not as critical.
That's a great question.
I guess maybe it won't be as critical of the person going out and evangelizing to other adults, but you got to start somewhere in the kids. Still.
So I think that this is so important, if I can just put in a shameless plug in for my dear wife, because a lot, sometimes it's frustrating, as Christians, as Catholics, because we want to evangelize and we want other people to evangelize, and they sometimes don't. But I think a really powerful motivator is when you have kids, because the notion of your kids losing their faith is really devastating. Well, we can fix that. There's a nice little ebook, how to talk to your kids about God. But it's true. You want to be able to give your kids at least a crash course in apologetics and get them to understand, hey, our faith is deeply rooted in just a rich intellectual tradition. We not only have good reasons for our faith, we have the best reasons. So,
don't give in to outside pressures that this is all just silliness
or fairy tales or whatever the typical caricature strawman portrayals are of the day. So how to talk to your kids about God over at thecatholicmama.com. Any gentlemen watching the show, hit that subscribe button. Be proud and listen to the Catholic Mama on the way to work.
The Catholic Mama is for Catholic dads as well.
That's right. Thanks again.
Thank you. Don't forget to head over to thecatholicmama.com to get your free copy of How to Talk to Your Kids About God. This handy little ebook will teach you how to broach the topic of God with your children, or how to respond to your kids when they want to talk about God, as well as give you answers to 7 of the trickiest questions about the faith that Christian parents face. You'll love the easy to understand grown-up answers, the pared down but not talked down answers you can share with your kids, plus recommended resources if you'd like to deepen your understanding of the topic. Get yours free at thecatholicmama.com.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.